Welcome back. To start tonight, I'm so pleased to be joined by Lula Woldemariam. Lula is an incredible leader in our community with over 15 years of experience working with folks through mental health, through addictions, and specifically with respect to supportive housing at House of Friendship. Lula, welcome here.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with, we're talking about affordability today, of course. Your work is with respect to supportive housing. And so I wonder if you could share more for folks about what supportive housing is and why it's so important.
Absolutely. So when you think of supportive housing, you're really looking at housing with supports. So you're looking under that affordability umbrella, right? So you've got folks in need of housing, but also with that wraparound supports to maintain their housing. So we're really looking to ensure that somebody is not facing eviction, so providing those supports so that they're successful in their housing journey.
And so what would be some examples of when you say a wraparound support, someone might be facing mental health challenges while also in need of housing? What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're really thinking about bringing those supports to that individual and making sure that that's in place. When you want somebody to just have that full successful journey, you want to make sure that they have what they need. So we're really thinking about, are their physical needs being met, their mental health needs, any concerns around their substance use that they want to address. And so we want to bring that to ensure that they're not finding themselves back in the shelter system or on the street. And so bringing those supports to them to keep that roof over their head is really the focus around supportive housing.
And that meaning that that person has access to all of the supports they might need. A nurse practitioner, for example, on site would be an example of those kinds of supports.
Absolutely.
Then, right?
When you think about, someone dealing with some challenges around addiction, you're thinking about what are the supports that they need through counseling or a methadone program, and making sure the accessibility to those services are available to them, whether that's in-house or ensuring that the support worker is able to connect them to those services so that they're able to maintain their recovery from being homeless.
So I mentioned in the introduction with respect to how the cost of housing has just exponentially increased. And we knew we were in a difficult position back in 2019, before the pandemic. In a lot of ways, we know this crisis we're in has only been made worse over the last number of years. What does that look like for you and for the folks at House of Friendship that you serve? What has the pandemic revealed to you, and what has that journey been like? Yeah,
I think it's just further amplified what's already been there, right? I think it's just really brought that to the surface and really highlighted the struggles and challenges that this population has been facing for a very long time. And so you bring the complexities of the pandemic into that. There was no ignoring it anymore, right? There was no shying away from the challenges this population was facing day in and day out, right? And so when you have the world sort of pause for 2 years, you're really forced to look at that, right? And we know that through media and the amount of coverage the homelessness crisis, the housing crisis has received alongside the opioid crisis as well, right? So I think all of those things were there, but they were just kind of pushed up and a bit more in our face than historically.
And in terms of some of the numbers, have you got that offhand in terms of how, what has been the increase in folks seeking support and looking for housing that House of Friendship is serving? Can you share anything with respect to how that might have changed?
Yeah, you touched a bit on those numbers, Mike, in the intro, but when we're really looking about the individuals that were accessing our supportive housing program, they're coming through us after having been chronically homeless for up to 6 months in order to qualify for a supportive housing unit. So you think about that, right? Someone has to experience the trauma of homelessness through the shelter system or sleeping rough in order to be put on a wait list, right? So you're looking at a wait list of up to 3 years potentially before you're able to find housing. And so that number is upwards of 300 people that are on that list waiting in homelessness to find supportive housing.
Well, on the flip side of it though also is it's forced us to innovate more. I was actually in the House of Commons just a few weeks ago sharing about shelter care. And the pride so many of us in this community have for the progress that House of Friendship has been able to make with respect to providing wraparound supports through a program like shelter care, and specifically the number of people who found permanent housing coming out of it. I know we've got some questions coming in from folks now. Anything, Lula, you'd like to share about shelter care in particular?
Yeah, I think when I think about the continuum of housing, right, you've got folks coming through the shelter care system and then into supportive housing, and you get them to a place of stability and supports that they're able to move on to more independent market rent housing, right? And we know all the challenges that come with that journey of getting someone there. my focus right now really is to get that emphasis on making sure all the supports are there for a supportive housing program to operate fully. And I think the vigor and support and backing that the shelter care model has had has been incredible. I think that also needs to be put into the supportive housing program, just in terms of getting folks that have now recovered from homelessness to a place that they're able to kind of move on from that program as well, but getting all the supports that they need.
And I imagine, like is true in so many areas of our community, to ensure that the attention that might have been received during the pandemic doesn't move away as we move through this. So whether that's related to arts and culture, whether it's related to housing, that this is going to need continued investment and sustained investment. I'll turn now to some questions we're getting. So Lorna in Kitchener is asking that she's looking to hear some ideas on how we can build and create more affordable housing specifically for people with disabilities. She notes in the fact that they rely on Ontario Disability Support Program for income. What would you want to say, Lula, as it relates to the additional challenges that someone might face living with a disability while also in search of affordable housing?
Absolutely, and I can kind of speak a little bit to what we have currently at our EB Village supportive housing building, right? It's a mixed building. We've got RGI units and then we've got supportive housing unit, and it creates for such a dynamic community of diversity, right? You've got folks in the senior population, you've got young folks all coming together and kind of living in that blended community, and I think it's so important to create accessible units in a community where folks who do have a disability can be a part of that community, but still having their needs met in an appropriate unit that fits their needs. And so I think what we need to start thinking about as we build more units is creating those barrier-free units so that those individuals are not further ostracized from the community but welcomed in with all the supports that they need.
And in terms of finding those accessible units, the numbers I've heard, right, in terms of the wait list for housing, if someone's on the affordable housing wait list, I've heard it's on average around 7 years or so. And of course, you can imagine what that looks like for someone. What does it mean to be waiting 7 years for housing? Do you have any sense? Is that I'd imagine that might be even longer still if someone might be waiting for an accessible unit. Is that the case?
Absolutely. We have individuals that we're currently supporting that are looking for barrier-free units, and as you can imagine, just by taking a guess at that it is longer than your typical unit that isn't built barrier-free.
Now, I know there's a bit of visions in the works at the House of Friendship with respect to a new facility, and I know accessible units are being spoken about part of that. Can you share much with us tonight, Lula, about that project? So
currently at House of Friendship, we've got our 2 supportive housing buildings in the downtown core. So we've got EB Village and Charles Village, and we're looking to really expand that, to really build on that campus and add to the housing stock, right? And we want to do that by creating more supportive housing units, but ensuring that we're meeting the needs. So we've done a lot of learning from what we've been offering and what is it that we need to tweak. And so we've really pulled in feedback from our tenants as well and our staff, just to kind of make sure that when we do build this new building, that we're ensuring we've learned and we're kind of addressing the needs. So absolutely, that's a big part of those discussions, is ensuring that we're meeting the needs of folks who are experiencing and living with disabilities.
Well, and I think we're so lucky in this community to have organizations like House of Friendship that are doing everything that they can on the ground. I'd love to, and we're getting a question from someone else saying, well, given the fact that you work in direct service, what are some of the points of advocacy you'd want to share when it comes to improving access to housing and recognizing that there's a lot that organizations like House of Friendship can do, but then there's also a lot that we need from government in terms of addressing kind of the rules of the game. Anything in terms that you'd want to share in terms of the advocacy that we need for changes to the housing market to better serve the people that you work with every day?
Absolutely, and so I can speak just to the obvious, the increase in the housing stock, right? So we do need to increase that, but added to that, in terms of another layer, is making sure the operational dollars are there for us to successfully staff these buildings and programs, and ensuring that all of those supports, medical, mental health, substance supports, are all in place, so that staff aren't burning out, that we're meeting the needs of the tenants appropriately. And so I think that funding needs to be not just year-long, right? It needs to be longer term.
I wonder if there's an analogy there. We talk often when it comes to healthcare that providing beds is not enough. If we don't have nurses and doctors at those beds, is that your view then on housing too?
Absolutely.
units aren't enough on their own?
Yeah, you need the staff, you need staff to be trained, and you need them to be equipped to do the work around the clock, right? As the needs of this population continue to change and the complexities increase, with the pandemic being a big part of that as well, we need to rise to that need, right? And the way things have historically been staffed, there needs to be a shift. And so we kind of need to move with the times, and having that funding and the staffing is a big part of that.
You mentioned supply earlier as well, and I know some folks back home might be thinking, okay, there are some people who say if we just had more supply of housing, this will all be okay. And I can imagine, Dr. Doucette and I might also be talking about this a bit later on. You'd used the term RGI earlier. I believe that is rent geared to income housing, right? Is there anything, Lula, you'd want folks to know in terms of the kind of supply of housing? Or do you feel like it's just, if we had simply had more units that would address, or is there anything in particular with respect to the kind of supply of housing that you feel like we really need?
I think I speak specifically to supportive housing, but I think about sort of that continuum. If we want folks to recover in a way that's really holistic and gets them to that place of true independence and stability, we need to look at all areas, right? And so when we look at our shelter system and moving someone through the shelter care and then into supportive housing, so it's meeting that appropriate need based on what we're seeing. And so ensuring that based on our wait list and what's out there, how many supportive housing units do we need, and focusing on that and then kind of moving through that. And so I would say there's room for all areas of housing, but definitely recognizing where we're at and starting there.
It's something I see in our community because, if you look at what's happening in the downtown in particular right now, there's a lot of development. A lot of that development, one bedroom condos, usually on the higher end of the market, that likely are the highest margin for that developer to build. When I speak with neighbors and folks across our community, one of the big gaps I hear about on a regular basis is families. 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units. How do we ensure we're providing affordable units for growing families in our community so that families can stay? And so that's kind of some of what I continue to hear. We've got another question. This person is asking, or they're sharing, that they feel there's been quite a bit of discrimination when it comes to renting. And I think they're having a difficult time when it comes to finding rentals in this community, and recognizing that, yes, there's a difficult market when it comes to buying for those that might be in a position to consider buying a home. It's also really difficult for those who are tenants and who are looking to rent in our community. Any input you'd want to share in terms of what needs to be done to protect affordable rental units across our community, and to ensure that there is kind of fair access to affordable rentals across our community?
Yeah, I think this is really coming down to there not being enough for everyone, right? And so you kind of have that in a rental world, but essentially a bidding war for some of these rental units that's happening. And so I think it's really important for government to get involved and ensure that we're not creating these scenarios or opportunities for this type of discrimination to happen. Under no circumstances is it okay, but you've created this sort of dynamic where now folks are finding themselves in these situations, right? And the same argument could be made for bidding wars for homes, right? Where all those prices for homes are rising in those exchanges when people bid.
And of course, there's a relationship between the two. Of course, as house prices go up, that's going to drive up rental prices as well. At a time when we know there is a disconnect in power between landlords and tenants. We'll be talking a little bit later on in terms of, there's some who are calling for a Bill of Rights when it comes to tenants. We've had rent control in this province before as well. So those are some of the ideas that I think we need to be pushing for when it comes to ensuring that we protect an affordable supply of rentals across our community as well.
Absolutely.
Is there more you'd want to share in terms of, House of Friendship is one of several providers across our community that are looking to meet this growing demand. Recognizing we've got organizations like Ray of Hope and the Working Center as well, Lutherwood, and just to name a few. Can you share with us, Lula, anything in terms of how these organizations are working together? What does that look like to provide a holistic set of supports for folks that might be trying to navigate. So another difficult challenge that I hear of often is even just trying for a person to make their way through the various supports that are available. What can you share in terms of how these organizations are working together in our community to be supporting folks?
Yeah, so I'll share. I'm new to this region in terms of like my career in housing, and so joining here, I think what I've realized is the like-mindedness of a lot of the organizations here that are working in housing. And so I think each individual organization has that same desire to address what's happening, right? To create more housing stock. And I think some of the barriers that we face is we have these really good-natured, good-hearted organizations and individuals pushing for that, is to really have that backing in terms of creating less barriers to access that money and funding, and to ensure that that goodwill of these organizations isn't being lost because of all of some of the red tape that comes up when you're trying to create more housing, build more housing, and all of that. So if we could kind of get past a little bit of that and create a bit more of a path, I think that there's so much opportunity for these organizations to work together. But when you're just getting stuck, it makes it hard to sort of collaborate, right? So.
Well, and that's something I've been so impressed by. It's one of the things I love about our community is the interest in building each other up, in coming together, recognizing that we're stronger together than we are on our own. We've got just under a minute left.
Yeah.
Lula, anything you'd want to share as kind of a final word or some parting wisdom for folks?
No, I think this right here, is what we need to continue doing, to not stop that conversation. As you said, Mike, we don't want to lose the momentum that we have right now. Housing isn't going to, fix itself, and we've got to continue having these difficult conversations and addressing that and problem solving and thinking really critically in ways that we haven't in the past. And so thank you for giving me this platform to be here today just to share a bit of my experiences, and I commend you for all the work that you've been doing in housing. Well,
I'm so glad you could join us. This to me is what makes this conversation really rich, is ensuring we have voices like yours a part of it. So thanks again for being with us tonight. We're going to head, I think, to a bit of a break here, and when we come on back, we'll have Dr. Brian Doucette from the University of Waterloo sharing with us more as we dig into how we need to address this housing crisis that we're in. Thanks again for being with us.
Great, thanks.
Welcome back. Our next guest tonight is Dr. Brian Doucette. Brian is the Canada Research Chair in Urban Change and Social Inclusion. He's also an Associate Professor at the University of Waterloo in the School of Planning. Brian's interests and research focus on the lived experience of urban change, gentrification, and displacement. Brian, welcome. So good to have you joining us.
Thanks for having me on the program, Mike.
It's a real honor between yourself and Lula. It's just such an honor to have you with us. So let's start. We started talking about the supply of housing. I know that's something that you're really passionate about. In particular, I mentioned earlier this term non-market housing. And in conversations we've had in the past, I know you're a real champion for the need for non-market housing that's affordable not just today but in the future as well. Can we start maybe if you can just share more with folks about what non-market housing is and why you see it as so important?
Yeah, maybe just backing up for a second, because we do talk a lot about the need to build and supply. And I think we need to shift that conversation away from how many units of housing do we need to build to questions of what kind of housing do we need to build, where do we need to build it, and who do we need to build it for. And then we see that actually it's not just about numbers, how many houses can we build in a year, because by some measures we actually build more than enough houses for our population. We just don't necessarily build them in the ways that we need them and the prices and the tenures. So that comes back to your question about non-market housing. Most housing in Canada is built by private developers, and they do it to make a profit. Non-market housing is anything that removes that profit either from the construction process and the development process, or from the end user, the owner, the tenant, and so on. So that's things like everything from the supportive housing that Lula spoke about so passionately a few moments ago, to co-op housing, rent geared to income housing, shared ownership schemes. There's all sorts of innovative examples where you can sort of remove the profit from housing, and then you find all of a sudden it actually becomes a lot more affordable, and the tenures, especially for renters, become a lot more secure.
Right. And that kind of makes sense. If we want to make sure that homes are for people as opposed to investors to speculate and trade on, well, let's focus on exactly that. You'd mentioned co-op housing. I want to share a statistic when it comes to some of the investments we used to make in co-op housing. So back in the early 80s, if you look at all the rental units that were constructed, it was over 6,500 units. It was 8% of all rental units constructed in 1982, for example, were co-ops. In 2020, that dropped to less than 1% of all rental units constructed, about 477 units. Can you share in terms of co-op housing? I've got my own experience living in co-op housing and seeing for myself how dignified and affordable co-op housing can be. Some of your reflections, Brian, in terms of the importance of co-ops? Yeah,
so you're right. We used to actually do a pretty decent job in this country of building non-market housing. We used to build between 10, 20, sometimes a little bit more, 1,000 units per year, not just co-ops, but social housing, non-market housing more broadly. Co-op housing is particularly interesting because it's very well suited to a range of incomes and a range of lifestyles, because a co-op housing project works on a break-even point. And so if you're removing the profit from the development of that housing, it allows you to sort of cross-subsidize things. So some people pay deeply below market rent, some people may pay slightly closer to market rent. It also gives a very secure tenure, right? The kind of security that you would get with home ownership. You're not under any threat that a landlord's going to evict you because they can make more profit renovating a unit and renting it out to somebody else. And we need to really think about reviving these kind of models. Until the early 90s, we had funding from both the federal government and from most provincial governments for the construction of social housing, whether that be rent geared to income, whether that be co-op housing or other forms of housing. And again, as we talked about, Canada did a pretty decent job in building those types of units. So about 10% or so of new housing was non-market housing. When the federal government in the early 90s, and in Ontario and other provinces, the provincial government in the mid-90s, got out of the business of directly funding the construction of new non-market social housing, co-op housing, and so on, we saw that construction basically evaporate.
Yeah. So let's talk about that then in terms of the federal budget. To me, this was one of the examples of a win. It's something that I've been advocating on in my time in Ottawa so far, is to say, well, if we're going to address this and we need the right, as you say, supply for whom, co-op housing is a proven solution. Sometimes we need innovation and new ideas, and we spoke about shelter care with Lula earlier. In some cases, there's existing ideas out there. We just need to invest in what we know works.
Yep.
And so, many of us had been putting the call out for building more co-op housing. In this budget, I was really glad to see it was $1.5 billion invested in co-op housing. That leads to 6,000 units, I think, over the next 4 or 5 years or so that would get built with that kind of investment. Do you want to share, Brian, your view when you look at what's in the federal budget? First of all, feel free to disagree, but when you look at what works and what you're concerned about when it comes to the federal budget, what reflections would you want to share?
Yeah, so the co-op housing piece was definitely something that was positive to see. If we put it into a broader historical context, we're still looking at very small numbers, so we need a lot more money. The federal government, they don't get involved in the day-to-day nitty-gritty of zoning and planning. They don't get involved in things like rent control. What the federal government can do, one of the things the federal government can do, is fund the construction of new, affordable, non-market housing. The federal government has the financial backing to do that. The decisions of where to do that and how to do it and who to involve are probably best left for lower levels of government. But if we had a steady stream of funding coming from the federal government down to provinces, down to cities, we could actually start, reducing some of those waiting lists that you spoke about earlier, building different kinds of housing. Federal government also has a lot of land that can be used. This land and other levels of government have it too, publicly owned land. That's got to stay in public ownership and be used as the sites where you build that kind of housing that the market is unwilling or unable to build. So other things that were interesting in the federal budget, there's talk of curbing speculation, right? There's a foreign buyer tax. There's some talk around taxation on flipping properties. All of those are good starts, but they don't go nearly far enough, right? The biggest issue with speculators isn't foreign speculators, it's Canadians, it's domestic speculators who buy 2, 3, 10, 20 properties as investment portfolios and as a, as an investment, yep. Or large financialized landlords who buy up entire apartment buildings, have huge portfolios, and they make the profit for their shareholders by extracting as much value, as much rent out of those properties as they can. And we see on the ground what that looks like is a lot of displacement, a lot of renovictions where people are evicted so that a unit can be renovated and rented out at a higher rate to generally more affluent people. And so curbing those kinds of speculations, I think, is really an important step as well.
So let's talk more about that, because that's exactly where I want to continue to advocate to the federal government to be doing more. We'll talk about one example. So when it comes to the commodification of the market, you were kind of mentioning some of the examples of this. One is these large real estate investment trusts. And there was a story in the Record just a few months ago about a real estate investment trust bought up 375 units, renovated the units, doubled the prices, the cost of those rents. Probably a great financial return for whoever's invested in that particular real estate investment trust. Not particularly helpful when it comes to ensuring we keep affordable and dignified units in our community. What reflections, and those are some things I was looking for. Could we do differently when it comes to taxation and get rid of the preferential tax treatment for these investment trusts? Yeah. What are some of your reflections, Brian?
Yeah, I think getting rid of those preferential tax treatments for real estate investment trusts, if they pass, I think it's 90% of their incomes onto their investors, they get quite a lot of tax breaks. Eliminating those, because we understand the harm that those kinds of investment trusts have on communities on the ground, on people living in those units, right? It's purely about maximizing profits. So disincentivizing some of those operating techniques, I think, is really important. I think there's also things like rent control, which is a provincial level jurisdiction, but that's really important as well. Ensuring tenants have the right to return if a unit is renovated. Sometimes units need to be renovated, apartments age, renovations need to be done. But if we have strict rules around ensuring that tenants have the right to return, and that right is protected and that right is enforced, and that they have adequate accommodation while their unit is being renovated. New Westminster in British Columbia has some really tough anti-renovation bylaws, and they've seen these renovations basically come down to zero. I think also too, thinking the big picture tax issues, a lot of pension funds invest in housing.
Right.
This is a very difficult conversation that we need to have. Do we want our pension funds, our pensions, our futures, investing in housing when those pension funds are not focused on affordable housing? They are focused on getting the maximum return for us while we struggle to afford housing in our communities. That's another very big question. That's something the federal government can play a role in regulating, but it's one we need to have.
Well, and it gets back to this concern with respect to speculation in the market. If you're one of these investment trusts or a pension fund and you're seeing a 35% return on housing, well, you're going to go where the market tells you to go.
Yeah.
You're going to go where the best return is to be had. And what that ends up with is, as I was sharing earlier, then young folks in our community saying, well, how am I ever going to get into this market? What future will I ever have? Even a nurse I spoke with a few days ago, Brian, and she said to me, you don't think the cost of housing affects all of us? Well, this was a nurse saying she was considering moving out of our community because her rents were going up again too.
Yeah.
And can't we all agree that we need more healthcare workers in our community? So some of us might be more buffered, but no one is immune to the reality of the extent of which cost of housing is going up.
Yeah. So there's 2 points that I would say to that. The first is, to acknowledge that we're talking about housing today because it affects sort of middle class households. It affects households that 10 years ago never would have dreamed they'd been victims of a housing crisis. But folks who are on low income, very low income, they've been in a housing crisis for decades, going back to at least that era when the federal government, the provincial government got out of the business of funding housing, affordable housing, if not earlier. So we're really talking about it today because it has affected a very large segment of the population. It's also important to acknowledge that while we're talking about affordable housing, we're talking about a housing crisis. There's another parallel set of conversations going on that's saying, actually, this is a market doing very, very well. This is a market yielding those 35% returns or gains, or investing in rental properties and getting very strong yields. This is a market doing what it should be doing, right? And that gets to the crux of the housing crisis, the housing problem, that in our society, housing is both shelter and a human right, and it's a commodity. And it can't succeed at both. It's not that we have to go one extreme to the other, shift the pendulum, completely to one end. But when I look at policies at all levels of government, I look and to what extent that pendulum is shifting away from treating housing as speculation towards treating housing as shelter and a human right.
Well, and when you speak about that pendulum, Brian, I think, well, hasn't it swung in one particular direction? It seems like it has, right?
It's swung pretty far towards the commodity side. You look at, in Ontario, we have about a quarter of all home buyers are investors. They're people who own another property and they're not living in that property, right? Across the country, it's a little over 20%. So yes, it has shifted pretty far to that commodification side. We need to shift it further towards the housing as a human right. And that comes through things like rent control, constructing non-market housing, taxing speculation, right? An anti-flipping tax, which is somewhat in the budget, but again, could be expanded a lot.
Well, and as you well know, even in the budget, it's not even quite an anti-flipping tax. It's just taking the preferential treatment so that they're taxed the same way everybody else is. I really appreciate you brought the provincial government as well, because the reality is this is all three levels of government that we need working together across party lines. Don't care what color you are in terms of a political party. Can't we all agree that the cost of housing being out of control right across the country is something we all need to be working on across all party lines and across all levels of government? I've got a question here from Mike. I promise it's not from me, but Mike's asking about the need for community input and he's suggesting that sometimes it can get in the way of progress at the local level. I think he's referring to this tendency towards not in my backyard. Yeah. We saw some of that come up when it came to a better tent city and some of the location they were looking for when they were looking to move. But we also know we need meaningful input in our democracy. And I know you've spent a lot of time listening to folks with lived experience. Anything, Brian, you'd want to say about how do we get that balance of hearing people's experience while ensuring we're operating in the interest of the community as a whole when we're making these really important decisions?
Yeah, great question. And I think there's two sort of somewhat different points to bring up with it. The first is, some decisions may need to be done at a provincial level. So things like eliminating single-family zoning, which was one of the very few good recommendations, in my view, from the province's Affordable Housing Task Force report. It was one of the ones that wasn't picked up by the province, but doing that at a provincial level, it removes some of that kind of backlash that is more difficult for a local politician to deal with. If it's just a provincial rule change, so as of right, any residential property in the province, you can build up to 3 or 4 units. Yeah. That's just changing the rules. It's not a magic bullet to solve housing affordability. It helps get some new units built, but it's not going to magically make housing cheaper. The second point about community input is, who's involved and who's excluded. And I've done a lot of work with the Social Development Centre of Waterloo Region, and we've been really trying to focus on some of the voices that aren't part of any of those conversations. The community input, right? The mainstream planning and policy and political conversations. People who have been victims of rent eviction, right? People who have really struggled to find housing on ODSP or OW. And what we've tried to do is sort of move beyond an anecdote here and an anecdote there and assemble a lot of that knowledge that people have of their communities and try and center that knowledge and those experiences within planning and policy making. The City of Kitchener has made a good start on their affordable housing initiatives to include those lived experience voices, but it's just a first step, and there's a lot more work to do.
So we're going to need to head to a break. In particular, I know, Brian, you've worked with the Social Development Centre on some of that, and so shout out to them and the incredible work they're doing there. Brian, thanks so much for being with us tonight, for sharing your insights here.
Thanks for having me on the program, Mike. It was a pleasure.
Appreciate it.